the focus on Latin America has taken away from the Middle East and from Asia Pacific.
This issue of President Trump wanting to own Greenland could undermine all of what could be possibly really historic achievements.
Completely unprecedented, the idea of NATO troops almost fighting with each other in this way. Hi guys, good to see you both again.
Hey guys.
Hey guys.
Well, last week we were talking about President Trump taking over Venezuela. This week we're talking about similar words around Greenland and Iran and what he may or may not do there. Very, very different situations, obviously, in terms of the countries and also in terms of what President Trump is saying about them. So we might have a bit of chat about those. Maybe we'll start with Iran, a very much developing story, of course, and one of these ones, as we always are, trying to second guess just what the president's intentions are.
It's interesting how he's kept it, as he often does, kind of intentionally vague. I think here at the White House, a lot of the speculation among the media was the first we would possibly hear of a decision is when something happens, because they really haven't given much away in terms of intentions or what he might be leaning towards. And the previous time we saw that saw them bombing Iran at a time when things seemed to have been dying down a little bit in last summer when they struck the nuclear facility. So I think it's interesting to see that kind of repeat itself in a similar but also quite different situation in the same country.
And I'm also really interested in the messaging we've heard from President Trump, where he has reached out directly in his words on camera and on his posts on social media to those protesters in Iran, saying, keep going, take over your institutions, which is quite extraordinary for a U.S. president to do. And we know at great peril to those protesters who have been battling Iranian forces there in IRGC. We have seen President Trump in the past when it comes to Venezuela, for example. He has talked about the purpose of U.S. foreign policy and his strategy, the intervention of Venezuela as being in part oil. Here, President Trump in the past hasn't talked about democracy and nation building as part of his strategy. And this is a bit different in a way in Iran, where he has people like Lindsey Graham, Senator Lindsey Graham, who has long been an Iran hawk, who say this is a real opportunity to change the regime in Iran and usher in a new democratic era. Now, that is, of course, a wildly, from Lindsey Graham's point of view, hopeful scenario, because it's still very unclear what the next steps hold for Iran. But it's a different message, let's say, than we've heard from President Trump on other foreign policy fronts.
And I think it's quite hard to compare Iran and Venezuela for so many reasons. It's just such a different situation, isn't it, in terms of geography, proximity to the US, in terms of the risk posed to the US from retaliation from Iran, much, much greater than Venezuela. You're talking about regime change of a regime that's ingrained for decades and decades, and that some people in Iran are quite happy with as well. We should point that out. We're seeing lots of protests, but there are others who support the government as well. And it's a very complicated situation, as we know from history, trying to get involved with the regime change without having a plan for supporting any individual that comes after that. And, you're talking about that post that President Trump put out where he was appealing to the Iranian protesters, and he said, save the names of the killers and abusers. And pretty soon afterwards, a senior Iranian official, actually one that President Trump has sanctioned this week, Ali Larijani, he wrote back to say on X, we declared the names of the main killers of the people of Iran. Number 1, Trump. Number 2, Netanyahu. So it's a very, very different situation and potentially a very hot one. And Brynny, when you're talking about the situation in June, Operation Midnight Hammer, I mean, President Trump was saying, I'll make a decision within 2 weeks, wasn't he? And then it was just a couple of days later that those major bombs were dropped in Iran.
And even then, in the days immediately before, have been kind of stepping away from that option. So with him, you never know. But I think the one major similarity between Venezuela and Iran is Trump really seems to have very little appetite for the major opposition figures in either country. With Venezuela, we've seen him be very kind of cordial about Delcy Rodriguez, the acting president. And in Iran, he's not wanted to meet with Reza Pahlavi, the kind of heir to the Iranian monarchy. And this is very much kind of a hangover from the global war on terror, in which institutions of Iraq, for example, were removed and it became very, very messy. And that's exactly what he promised to avoid. So, when he talks about regimes falling, he doesn't actually mean the day-to-day running of governance in Venezuela and Iran, because that's something that the US has had very bad experiences with over the last 25 years.
Another similarity, actually, that I see is the fact that obviously in the US, you have not only a big Venezuelan diaspora, but also a big Iranian diaspora that, has been here for many years. And they have also been very supportive of President Trump taking a stronger hand with the Iranian regime, very much in favor of the US trying to carry out some sort of operation that would lead to regime change. We've seen, and I've received messages from Iranian Americans as well who have said, this is the opportunity that we've been looking for. And they see these protests and this movement as different, as involving a wider swath of the Iranian public, of more people being willing to go out onto the streets and protest because of the harsh, severe economic situation that Iran finds itself in right now. And that's what, and Bernie, I know you were down reporting with Venezuelans in Florida. That was a very similar picture to what they saw, which is that President Trump is at least someone who is standing up for Venezuelans in and outside of the country against a repressive regime. So, that will add in a way to the pressure that President Trump is feeling. And certainly we've seen lawmakers who represent those communities in particular being particularly vocal about what the administration should do. And that includes Democrats. I mean, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, a congresswoman from Florida, she was one of the first Democrats not to criticize President Trump's Operation Venezuela, but to say, okay, now take the next step, ensure that there is a democratic government. And I wonder to what extent the Iranian Americans will also influence that conversation at the White House.
And to that point, I think, one challenge from the White House was that by promising to help the protesters, in a way, President Trump kind of boxed himself into taking action one way or another, and we don't really know what that action would take. This week, they've announced sanctions against figures inside the Iranian regime, but it's not clear whether that is the help that President Trump promised, or whether that's just one aspect of action the U.S. government is taking against the Iranian government. But I do think by saying that he would help these people, he's almost kind of boxed himself into doing something, but just what that something is hasn't really been made clear at any point during this whole kind of crisis.
Yeah, those sanctions were really interesting because at the start of the week, we saw President Trump imposing secondary sanctions, didn't we? 25% on countries that do business with Iran, then doing business with the Americans, and then those other sanctions which came on individuals who are supporting the supreme leader, banking methodologies and so on. And I was speaking to some of our BBC Persian colleagues about this to say, like, what impact do sanctions like that have, when there had been a sense during the week that the protesters were waiting for some very serious action, that strong action that the president was talking about. And they were telling me that the second round of sanctions on those individuals and the shadow banking system were more symbolic, that, if you were a senior person in Iran, you've already been sanctioned by the US possibly a couple of times. You have very unfavorable views towards the US, to put it mildly. So it's unlikely that you have your money stored in this country, at least not in your own name anyway. Whereas those sanctions, those secondary sanctions, were likely to have a much greater impact, because we have to remember these protests began a couple of weeks ago over an unsustainable cost of living, over a dire economic crisis, a rate of inflation that in December reached 42.2%. When you think we have rows in this country about rates of inflation that are 2, 3, 4%, it's kind of eye-watering. Food prices had gone up 72% month on month. So our Persian colleagues were saying those sanctions, those secondary sanctions, actually will make things even worse for an already struggling population, and that would put a really extreme amount of pressure on the regime and possibly see the protests continuing and just a very unsustainable situation. Whereas the second batch of sanctions that were on individuals was more about telling the Iranians, we are doing something, we are thinking of you, telling the regime we are coming for you, without necessarily being at the point yet, or if at all, we don't know, of a kinetic military action.
And that brings, I think, us back to one of the points that you were making, Bernd, a little bit earlier, which is, has President Trump kind of painted himself into a corner? This is something that a number of analysts have been telling me this week, that when it comes to either kinetic military action or even some of those sanctions, that President Trump has essentially promised quite a bit to these protesters who are watching closely. Of course, communications in Iran have been blacked out. It's difficult for information to come in and out of Iran, but those protesters do understand that President Trump has offered that message of support. And in that threat to the Iranian regime, in some ways, and some of the analysts I've been speaking to have said, it almost limits his ability to act because he has promised certain action. And, in a way, he has drawn a red line of his own making. That's the words that one analyst used to describe the situation to me this week. And I asked that analyst, do you think that President Trump's administration has thought about what this ends up actually doing, whether they be sanctions, to your point, Katrina, and what impact that might have on the economy that's already suffering, or kinetic military action? If you remove the supreme leader from power, what does that do with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard? What does a transition for Iran look like? And the analyst indicated to me, he said, I'm not sure that they have really thought that through, but that doesn't mean that, these discussions aren't happening at the White House every day.
That was the big point about the aircraft carrier as well, wasn't it? The USS Ford that had moved to the Caribbean ahead of the Venezuela operation, and now we're told is on its way back to the Middle East, but the journey is likely to take a week or so. So are these sanctions and things kind of playing for time, really, until the US military is in a position that, whatever about launching a strike, that it would be capable of dealing with any retaliation?
And that, again, is kind of a situation of the administration's own making. I mean, the fact that there's no carrier in the Middle East is the first time in decades that that's the case, certainly since 9/11. And that's because of the focus on Venezuela. So I was speaking to someone close to the White House yesterday, and there's a concern kind of about overstretch, that the focus on Latin America and fighting drugs and Venezuela has taken away from the Middle East and from Asia Pacific. We can't be everywhere at once. So I think that's something that the administration will now perhaps be rethinking, whether they can pivot as much as they had away from those other regions in which the US is so kind of invested militarily.
And somewhere that the US does have a military presence already, of course, is on the island of Greenland, which we've also been talking about a lot this week. And that quite extraordinary press conference from the Greenland foreign minister and the Danish foreign minister after they came out of the meeting with Vice President J.D. Vance and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, basically saying, we tried to change their mind and put our position forward, and we were unsuccessful in that. And the president is resolute in his plan that he wants Greenland for himself. And I was at that press conference that the ministers held at the Danish embassy, and it really, their sense of kind of disbelief in a way that this is where they are, a year into the administration, kind of still saying, our country is not for sale. We're not selling it. How many times do we have to say that?
I found it really interesting as well. I was watching a translation of an interview that the Greenland foreign minister gave with media back in Greenland. And she broke up in the middle of it and got quite emotional and said, basically talked about just how difficult the last few days or weeks have been for her and for, of course, who she represents, the people of Greenland. And it's truly remarkable to see, the tone, to your point, Katrina, that we saw from Denmark's foreign minister, from Greenland's foreign minister, to say, look, we haven't bridged that gap entirely. All we can do is sit here and hope that this high-level working group that's been established can hold some sort of negotiations that will be amenable to the U.S. and its concerns about security in the Arctic, but does not cross Greenland and Denmark's red lines. And that messaging, I think, I found it interesting that the Danish foreign minister, that they held a reception for several members of Congress, and that they've been meeting on Capitol Hill with members of Congress across the aisle, really kind of building that flank of support, at least from that branch of government in the U.S., understanding that the weeks ahead could involve really, really difficult talks and negotiations, despite the fact that they have laid out very clearly the position that Greenland's not for sale and the U.S. won't own it.
And I think there's very real concern on Capitol Hill about what this means for the NATO alliance. Even if the U.S. doesn't take Greenland, the imagery of NATO allies, Sweden, France, the UK, Germany, announcing troop deployments to Greenland is really remarkable. I mean, these deployments are very small. It's 12 Germans, a single officer from the UK so far, but just the message being sent there that we don't need the US for Greenland's defense, and we can do this together. It's kind of extraordinary how it's playing out like that, I think.
I was speaking to Senator Dick Durbin on one of our shows this week, and he's part of that delegation of members of the House and the Senate who are heading over to Copenhagen. They're there at the moment, actually, to meet members of the Danish government, the Greenlandic government. And I sort of said, what kind of reception do you think you're all going to get there? Because US-Danish relations are strained at the moment, to put it mildly. And he was quite resolute that, this is something the president wants to do, and the president alone. And obviously he's a Democrat and he doesn't agree with Trump on almost anything. But it was kind of that sense, he said, if this gets very serious, I'm confident there is support across the aisle in both of the chambers for a War Powers Resolution Act or something similar to that, to prevent the president taking any military action in Greenland. And, to what you've been saying, Bernie, there, it's just completely unprecedented, the idea of NATO troops almost fighting with each other in this way. And, there is a US military presence on the island. They work side by side with their Danish counterparts in the Joint Arctic Mission there. They used to have 17 bases on the island. Actually, they only have one right now. And speaking to officials from Denmark and Greenland, they just can't get over where this is coming from. They just say time and time again, we are struggling with what the intent is here. We don't want to be having conversations about acquiring Greenland or buying Greenland, because it's just such a preposterous sort of notion in the first place, because we're open to conversations about national security. We're open to conversations about the environment. We're open to conversations about the natural resources. In fact, Greenlanders would welcome American companies coming in, because it's an island of 57,000 people. They simply don't have the workforce to exploit all the resources that they have on their island. It's, as you were saying, Sumi, it's just so upsetting when you speak to Greenlanders. They're so upset. It's so emotional. It's so personal for them, and it's so confusing for them as well.
I was speaking to a member of parliament from Greenland, and he's one who he's from a party that has advocated for a lot more U.S. presence, but not U.S. ownership. And he kept coming back to the point. He said, I asked him about what middle ground there might be between what the U.S. wants and more security and what Denmark wants. And he said, we don't see a compromise or middle ground. Greenland is for the people of Greenland. He has advocated for independence indeed. And he has said, I asked him about that post that the White House official account put out of 2 dog sleds with Greenland flags, given the choice between 2 paths between Russia and China or the US. And he said, we don't see either of those as our paths. We see our own path. And as you said, Katrina, this is deeply upsetting and really offensive, I think, to many people in Greenland, that they are now having to defend what they see as their sovereignty, even as they struggle with their historic, what this MP has said, mistreatment by Denmark as well. And so this is one where you certainly have many people in Greenland very anxious. And I found it was interesting to see the Danish foreign minister. He did an interview with Fox News after that meeting and that he had on Wednesday. And he was asked about whether the Trump administration were to make payments to the people of Greenland, which has been floated as an option. And he said, well, look, first of all, I don't think they would agree still to join the United States. That's not what the people of Greenland want. And he also said, by the way, I don't think the U.S. wants to own Greenland and to pay for the Scandinavian social welfare system that we have, which is very different from the US system. It was an interesting point that he made there, but again, pointing out that this is simply not a topic of discussion, neither for Greenland nor for Denmark.
Or for the US, really. I mean, Trump has not deviated from his message that he wants Greenland one way or another for months now, even before we started talking about it recently. The only sort of wiggle room he seems to show is how exactly that comes about. But they've repeatedly said that every option is a table, so he's not really willing to negotiate the end goal of these discussions either. He's just more publicly curious about how this comes about, but he's very, very insistent that this is going to come about one way or another. And I thought it was very interesting. This week, reporters in the Oval Office posed a question to him about the leader of Greenland saying that Greenlanders don't want the U.S. to own it, and he said, "That's not my problem. I don't know anything about him. That's not my problem," which is an extremely dismissive answer about, an ally. So I think, as of now, as the Danish official said, they've just agreed to disagree, and there doesn't really seem to be much potential room for agreement on either side at the moment.
And they do find those remarks incredibly offensive from the president and members of his administration. But there are many facts as well that are, in dispute here. I mean, President Trump keeps saying, to your point, Sumi, China and Russia will take over Greenland. And the Danish officials keep saying, we have no intelligence that shows that there are Chinese warships or submarines anywhere near Greenland, and there haven't been for decades. So, of course, there's a national security risk at some level to every nation and where we are in the world at the moment in particular, but it's not that sort of immediate a threat, which is how President Trump is kind of selling it. And that point of making payments to the Greenlanders, which they just reject as completely offensive and don't engage in a discussion on. I've heard strategists from Republican and Democratic parties this week saying, hang on a minute, if the president has money to give $100,000 or whatever to the people of Greenland, what can he give to the people of Missouri or Kansas or Michigan or New York or anywhere? Why is he giving money to other people when so many in this country are struggling with the cost of living and the affordability, the hoax word, as the president likes to call it, and what we kind of keep coming back to time and again, no matter what we talk about, because it is the number one issue of concern.
I saw a report in the New York Times where they were talking about perhaps this being an incredible achievement for President Trump, that we could say, maybe after a year and a half in, that he might have really destroyed or really damaged Iran's nuclear sites and upended repressive regimes in Iran, in Venezuela, in Cuba, if you throw it forward and see these as possible achievements for President Trump. But then this issue of President Trump wanting to own Greenland could undermine all of what could be possibly really historic achievements from his perspective, from President Trump's perspective. And, it all comes back to a few strategists I was speaking to this week. Democrat strategists have said, look, much of this really begs the question again, is this a distraction? Talking about owning Greenland, about needing it for national security, is it a distraction from the continued woes that the administration is facing on economic issues, on cost of living in the United States? Now, the Trump administration says, no, not at all. This is all, hand in hand with our strategy. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can make sure that we're projecting American power on the global stage and providing answers for the American people. But Democrats are pointing out that those numbers, the polling numbers on the economy, on cost of living, still continue to be pretty poor for President Trump. And some people could see this as a distraction.
I suppose what it is distracting from is, this time last week we were also talking about an ICE agent shooting a woman in a car dead, and the protests that came from that and the different versions of events of the same videos. Those protests are ongoing, more ICE agents deployed, but yet much of the conversation now is, a sort of notional element, if you like, about what might happen in Greenland. So we know President Trump is the master of distraction, and as those strategists were saying to you, Sumi, you do have to question what else is going on while these things are sort of going on publicly. And I guess only time will tell. A week is 5 years in this country at the moment. So who knows where we'll be when we're chatting this time next week. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you, so please leave us a comment below or email us at path@bbc.co.uk.